Welcome to Norse Mythology, the unofficial guide. It's unofficial because I'm neither a credentialed academic nor a time-traveling medieval Norse pagan, but I deal with this material directly from the sources, interpreted through the lens of the experts and their opinions. If you're looking for depth and detail in a simple and accessible way, then you're in the right place. Gunnlov mer of gav, gulnum stoli å, drykkens dyra mjadar. Idgjöld lete kan efterhava, sintsins hela hugar, sintsins svara seva. You'll have to bear with me as I'm going to leave you hanging on the meaning of this lamentful stanza for just a little bit. In the last episode, we talked about the very first war that took place in the world, a war most traditionally thought to have been fought between two groups of gods, the Æsir and the Vanir. Although, as it turned out, figuring out exactly who the Vanir are, or even what the war was really fought over, is more easily said than done. But at this point, the war has ended, and we can start talking about its crazy after effects. Back in Snorri's Edda, the war ends and a truce is made. In Ynglinga Saga, he gives us a whole story about a hostage exchange, which leads to Mimir's head being cut off and sent back to the Æsir, and how Oðinn smears some herbs on it to prevent decay and performs magic spells over it that allow it to speak to him. But in Snorri's Edda, we don't get any of that. Instead, Snorri tells us that to solidify the truce, both sides approach a vat and they spit into it. After the proceedings are over, the gods, who true to form can't let something gross go to waste, take the spit mix and turn it into a man who they name Kvasir, and whose name probably comes from an old word for the juice of a fermented berry. You'll see why in a minute. Kvasir is so wise that it seems nobody can ask him a question that he can't answer, so he ends up traveling the world and sharing his knowledge with others. That is, until he meets a couple of conniving dwarf brothers named Fjalar and Galar, who invite him to a private meeting, murder him, store his blood in 2 vats and a pot, mix it with honey, and brew it into a mead. And because the mead is made with Kvasir's blood, anyone who drinks it becomes a poet or a scholar, and as a result, poetry can now be referred to with the phrase Kvasir's blood. Fjalar and Galar have to explain Kvasir's death to the Æsir, of course, so they tell them that, hey, everything here is perfectly normal. Kvasir simply suffocated on his own intelligence, because he came to a place where everyone was just too uneducated to ask him any questions, and gosh, he just couldn't get any of that intelligence out, and darn if it didn't just kill him. But yeah, definitely nothing untoward going on here. And the Æsir apparently accept this absurd explanation. However, these dwarves are essentially serial killers that can't seem to help themselves, and so, at some point after this, and for some unknown reason, they decide to kill again. The dwarves invite a Jotun called Gillingr, as well as his wife, who is unnamed of course, to visit them. During the visit, the dwarves invite Gillingr to ride with them on their rowboat out to sea, which he does. And once they're out at sea, the dwarves deliberately capsize the boat and Gillingr drowns because he can't swim. They right the boat, row back to land, and report to Gillingr's wife that her husband has drowned. She becomes upset at the news and starts weeping and howling, which Fjalar finds annoying. So the dwarves offer to show her the spot in the ocean where her husband drowned, and Fjalar instructs his brother Galar to hide above the doorway to their home with a heavy millstone, and when Gillingr's wife comes outside, he drops it on her head and kills her too. Let's pause for a second here and talk about dwarves. In modern times, most of us have been conditioned to think about dwarves as unusually small but still anthropomorphic beings. Dwarfism is even a recognized name for a medical condition. But in the Eddas, our core sources for Norse mythology, dwarves are actual magical creatures, and we don't get any direct information from pagan poetry telling us that they were especially small. There is a prose introduction to the poem Regnsmal that refers to a character named Hjalprek as being, quote, a dwarf in height, end quote, but that introduction was added much later than the actual poem was composed, so it's not until much later that we start getting direct attestations of dwarves being small, many of which come from the sagas. In Gylfaginning, Snorri describes an event that happens at the funeral for the god Balder, where Thor is consecrating the funeral pyre with his hammer, and, quote, a certain dwarf ran in front of his feet. His name was Lit. Thor kicked at him with his foot and thrust him into the fire, and he was burned, end quote. Just from the way that interaction is described, it sounds like the dwarf is much smaller than Thor, interfering with just his feet and then getting kicked away. So it's hard to know for sure whether dwarves were thought of as small during the pagan period, or whether that was a later folkloric evolution derived from some outside influence. The most important function of dwarves that sets them apart as a unique class in the mythology is their ability to craft magic items. Dwarves create Thor's hammer and his wife's golden hair. They create Odin's spear and a ship that Freyr can fold up and carry around in his pocket. There are tons of examples, and here it's the serial killer dwarves Fjalar and Galar who create the magical mead of poetry. What's kind of an amazing dynamic to think about along these lines is that the gods themselves seem completely unable to create any magic items on their own, or at least they're never described as doing so. To be clear, the sources don't explicitly say the gods can't create magic items, just that they always get these types of things from dwarves and are willing to jump through whatever hoops the dwarves specify in order to complete the transaction. The gods can create life, of course. They created the first humans, and they created Kvasir in this story. But it looks a lot like they require the dwarves, who Snorri tells us they themselves also created out of the maggots infesting Ymir's corpse, in order to get their hands on magic weapons or unbreakable fetters or gold that produces more gold, and things like that. Dwarves almost always live underground or inside rocks in the sources. And to this day, there's still a lot of folklore in parts of Scandinavia about mischief-making subterranean creatures. In this story, when Fjalar instructs his brother Galar to hide above the doorway with a millstone to drop on the head of Gillinger's wife, it might be most accurate to interpret this doorway as some kind of a rock-based entrance into the ground or into a mountainside through that lens, as opposed to the doorway of a wooden house or something like that. But this is also a nice tie-in to what I keep reiterating about the size of Jotnar. Almost all English translations of Norse mythological literature use the word giant as a stand-in for the words Jotun, Thurs, and Risi. These words seem like they might have had some nuance to them in the past, but are also used relatively interchangeably in the sources, so you can see why it would be nice to have a common English word to use in place of all three. But it's hard to come up with a word that really seems to fit the concept, so traditionally, we end up with giant. The problem, however, is that most of these so-called giants aren't gigantic beings, and we see the assumption of their normal size all over the place. This story is a prime example. The dwarves, who may or may not be extra small individuals, have invited a Jotun couple to visit them. The husband is able to fit in the dwarves' rowboat, and they're able to row him out to sea without a problem. And after that, when they offer the wife the opportunity to see the place where her husband drowned, she emerges from inside the dwarves' home, fitting through the doorway, and a millstone, being held by a dwarf, is large and heavy enough to kill her when dropped on her head. Little examples like this are myriad. Another one off the top of my head is that in the story where Thor battles the Jotun Hrungnir, Oðinn and Hrungnir engage in a horse race, and both of them ride horses from Jotunheimr to Osgardr. So we end up in this situation where, if we want to believe the Jotnar are gigantic, then we also have to believe the Æsir are gigantic, and that there are also gigantic horses, and that every river Thor approaches is too gigantic for his own gigantic self to step over, and that dwarves own gigantic rowboats and homes, and therefore might have to be gigantic themselves, even though they're small enough to get in the way of Thor's feet. And then, once we've decided that everything, including the gods, must be gigantic, we have to ask ourselves why, in the story where Thor visits Utgarda-Loki and a Jotun who is actually gigantic comes along, Thor and Loki are able to hide inside his glove, mistaking it for a cave, and why Thor, who hunts Jotnar pretty much all day every day, seems completely surprised to be confronted by a gigantic character. The other option, of course, is to assume that these beings are generally pretty close to normal size. And suddenly, with that assumption, we no longer have anything to reconcile. We just accept that sometimes Jotnar can be out of the ordinary. Maybe the one in that story was big, but he's an outlier, just like Loki's daughter Hel, who is half living and half corpse, or Tyr's grandmother, who has 900 heads. Getting back to the story, the Jotun couple killed by Fjalar and Galar had a son named Suttungr, who, just based on Snorri's choice of words, doesn't seem to be present when the dwarves kill his parents. But he realizes that something has gone wrong, maybe because his parents never returned. We don't know exactly. But somehow he, quote, found out about this and, quote, went there and seized the dwarves. Upon capturing them, he takes them out to a skerry, which, in this case, is like a small rock island that protrudes out of the water at low tide, but becomes completely submerged at high tide. Suttungr places the dwarves on the skerry, intending to let them drown when the tide comes in. But the dwarves start begging for their lives, and they offer to give Suttungr the magic mead that they made out of Kvasir's blood if he will agree to spare them. Suttungr finds this proposal to be an acceptable form of compensation, and the trade is made. Fjalar and Galar now drop out of the story. Presumably they just keep on killing. And Suttungr takes the mead home with him to a mountain called Hnitbjorg and places it under the care of his daughter Gunnlöð. Earlier, when the dwarves killed Kvasir and gave the Æsir a ridiculous explanation about him suffocating on his own intelligence, the Æsir seemed to take this at face value. But what becomes clear at this point in the story is that Oðinn, who will stop at nothing to acquire wisdom and knowledge, is actually aware of the magic mead. Oðinn takes on a disguise, and as part of that disguise, adopts the name Bolverker, which means something along the lines of evil-doer, and he heads out to visit Suttungr's brother, a Jotun named Baugi. As he gets close, he finds that Baugi has 9 slaves all out working in the field, all mowing down hay with dull scythes. So Oðinn produces a whetstone that he just happens to have brought along with him, and offers to sharpen their blades. Freshly sharpened blades, of course, make the work a lot easier, so the slaves ask Bolverker, Oðinn, if they can buy the whetstone from him. He agrees to sell it, and sets the price at basically whatever you guys think it's worth. But each slave wants to buy the whetstone for himself, so rather than giving it to any one of them, Oðinn tosses it up into the air, and as the slaves all scramble to catch it and fight over it, they all end up cutting each other's throats with their scythes, and they all die. When Oðinn finally comes to Baugi's house, Baugi is upset because his slaves have all just mysteriously killed each other out of nowhere, and he's worried about his financial situation because he doesn't have anyone to do the work that needs doing around the property. Oðinn claims that he has the ability to do the work of all 9 slaves by himself, and offers to work for Baugi over the course of a summer, and in return, all he wants is a single draft of Suttungr's magic mead. Baugi replies basically, I can't promise you anything because I don't have any say over what my brother does with his mead, but if you do the work for a summer, I'll at least go with you to Suttungr's house and we can ask. Oðinn agrees, works for a summer, and then the 2 of them set off to get the mead. When they arrive, Baugi explains the situation to Suttungr, but Suttungr refuses to give up even a single drop of the mead, so Oðinn asks Baugi to help him get the mead through trickery instead, and Baugi agrees. Oðinn now hands Baugi an auger that he just happens to have brought with him, and which even has a name, Rati, and he instructs Baugi to drill a hole into the mountain. When Baugi tells Oðinn he's finished drilling, Oðinn checks the hole by blowing down into it, and when he does, a bunch of dust flies back up at him. Now, this is a problem because it means the hole hasn't actually gone all the way into the mountain like Baugi said it did, and that means that Baugi is not being fully honest and cooperative. Oðinn instructs Baugi to drill again, and this time, when Baugi finishes and Oðinn blows into the hole, nothing comes back up, so he realizes that the hole has now finally gone all the way into the mountain. Oðinn quickly transforms into a snake and slithers into the hole, and Baugi starts trying to stab after him with the auger, but he's not quick enough, and Oðinn makes his way into where Gunnlöð is guarding the mead. Oðinn's interactions with Gunnlöð are unfortunately not explained in any detail by Snorri, although we do get a little more insight into it in the poem Havamal, which I'll come back to. But Snorri tells us that Oðinn sleeps with Gunnlöð for 3 nights, after which point she allows him exactly 3 drafts of the special mead. But 3 drafts are all he needs. In fact, Oðinn gulps down all of the mead in those 3 gulps, transforms into an eagle, and begins flying away as fast as he can. But Suttungr sees Oðinn flying away, so he takes on the shape of an eagle himself and gives chase all the way to Ásgarður. When the Æsir see Oðinn approaching, they quickly fetch some empty vats and put them in the courtyard, which maybe indicates that they were all aware of Oðinn's plan to get the mead from the beginning. And as Oðinn closes in with Suttungr right on his tail, he attempts to spit all of the mead into the vats, but it's sloppy. Suttungr comes so close to catching Oðinn at this point that his aim is a little off, and some of the mead goes flying backwards out of Osgarðr and ends up essentially abandoned as sort of the cost of doing business. And that seems to be how it made its way into the human population. Snorri doesn't tell us exactly how Oðinn finally escaped from Suttungr. Instead, he abruptly ends the story here. What's interesting is that even though this is the most complete narrative we have of this story, it's actually referenced in a few other places, including a couple of places in the poem Havamal, which give us a little bit of conflicting information, as well as a beautiful insight into Odin's interactions with Gunnlod. Let's start with Havamal 13 and 14. Quote, "The forgetfulness heron it's called, who hovers over ale drinking. He steals a man's mind. With this bird's feathers I was fettered in the court of Gunnlod. Drunk I was more than drunk at wise Fjallar's. That's the best about ale drinking, that afterwards every man gets his mind back again." End quote. What's pretty cool about Havamal is that, although parts of the value system it implies are archaic, it offers a lot of really solid life advice. These two stanzas about being drunk on the mead, illustrated by the metaphor of being fettered with the feathers of the forgetfulness heron, are an example that Oðinn provides of why drinking isn't so good for you. Just before this, in stanza 12, he says, quote, "It isn't as good as it's said to be, ale, for the sons of men, for the more a man drinks, the less he knows about his own mind." End quote. But more importantly, in stanza 14, Oðinn seems to be referring to the court of Gunnlod as the same place as Fjallar's home. But in Snorri's version, the dwarf Fjallar and the Jotun woman Gunnlod live in separate locations and have absolutely nothing at all to do with each other. It's a cool indication of variation in the mythology. But what I absolutely love is the account that Oðinn gives us in stanzas 104 to 110. There's a sad fact that oftentimes these stories tend to leave out dialogue, actions, and even names of female characters. But that isn't always the case. And these stanzas are a great example. Pay attention to the way Oðinn describes his dealings with Gunnlod here, and also how he seems to feel about it looking back. Quote, "I visited the old giant. Now I've come back. I didn't get much there from being silent. With many words I spoke to my advantage in Suttung's halls. Gunnlod gave me on her golden throne a drink of the precious mead. A poor reward I let her have in return, for her open-heartedness, for her sorrowful spirit. With Rati the augur's mouth I made space for myself and made it gnaw through the rock. Over me and under me went the giant's paths. Thus I risked my head. That bargain-bought beauty I made good use of. The wise lack for little, for Oddreyrir has now come up to the rim of men's sanctuaries. I am in doubt as to whether I would have come back from the giant's courts if I had not used Gunnlod, that good woman, and put my arms about her." The next day the frost giants went to ask for the High One's advice in the High One's hall. They asked about Bolverk, whether he was amongst the gods, or whether Suttung had slaughtered him. I think Oðinn will have sworn a sacred ring oath. How can his pledge be trusted? He left Suttung defrauded of the drink, and made Gunnlod weep. End quote. How can his pledge be trusted? He left Suttung defrauded, and made Gunnlod weep. At the beginning of this episode, I recited stanza 105 here in Old Norse. Gunnlod gave me on her golden throne a drink of the precious mead. A poor reward I let her have in return, for her open-heartedness, for her sorrowful spirit. Oðinn is a fascinating character in our sources for lots of different reasons. For one, he engages in activities that Norse society considered extremely taboo. In the poem Lokasenna, he's accused of, and even sort of acknowledges, that he sometimes grants victory to the wrong side in battle. He dictates our only real religiously philosophical treatise in Havamal, with tons of great life advice, but he also labels himself evil-doer, and manipulates characters into killing each other, and, on more than one occasion, cruelly takes advantage of women for his own purposes. But what gives him some real depth of character, as we see here, is that sometimes he seems to regret it. There's another really interesting detail here that's easy to miss. Back in the Prose Edda, during the creation story, Snorri told us that the very first being, Ymir, was evil, and so were all of his descendants, the Hrimthursar, or frost giants. Snorri may have gotten that from a line in Vafthrûdnismal 31 that uses a word to indicate that all Jotnar are fierce or hideous or loathsome. But I've also emphasized how Jotnar can change sides and come to be considered as Æsir, simply by marrying into the family. Here, Havamal calls Gunnlóð, who is a Jotun, Inar góðu konu, literally, that good woman. She's a good woman who opened her heart to a man that quite explicitly used her to steal her father's mead. This is who Oðinn is. The story in Havamal is also a little different from Snorri's version in a couple of other ways. For example, Havamal names the mead itself Oðrörir, whereas Snorri actually gives this as the name of one of the vessels the dwarves brew the mead in. Oðrörir means something close to inspiration stirrer. You'll actually see the root Oðr translated in a lot of different ways because there isn't a great English equivalent. We see it as part of Oðinn's name, for example, which often gets translated as the mad one or the frenzied or furious one. But it also has these connotations of something like a furor poeticus. It's the metaphorical idea of a poet possessed by the muse. Maybe the best English translation for Oðr is something like being in the zone. Havamal also doesn't mention anything about Odin's transformation into a snake or an eagle, although it does maybe hint at these things when Oðinn makes space for himself with the auger, and when it mentions that the Hrimthursar wondered if Suttungr had slaughtered him. On the other hand, Snorri's account doesn't mention the search party of Hrimthursar that go looking for Bolverk the following day that we see in Havamal. Snorri has Oðinn taking 3 large gulps and then flying away, while in Havamal, Oðinn talks about getting drunk on the mead at Gunnlóð's court. But this doesn't mean we need to toss out Snorri's unique details as if they are all his own inventions. A lot of them are actually corroborated in this case by kennings found throughout skaldic poetry. For example, we have instances where the mead of poetry is referred to as dvergadrykkr, meaning drink of the dwarves. Another one is Withur's Thyvi, which means Odin's theft. And yet another one is Arnarkjapta Orð, which means like seed of the eagle's jaw. There's even a picture stone dated to the 7th century called Stora Hammars 3 that shows a woman offering a drinking horn to a man in an eagle costume, while another man with a blade, presumably Suttungr, stands behind her. Assuming the dating of the stone is correct, the indication is that some of Snorri's details are verifiably as old as the beginning of the Viking Age. But that's not all. Simek notes that in the Rig Veda, the Indian god Indra steals an intoxicating cult drink of poets called Soma with the help of a bird, or possibly in the shape of a bird, from a hiding place in a mountain, and barely makes it out by the skin of his teeth. This type of thing is exciting to me. It's important to remember that there is no moment in time when a snapshot of Norse mythology was the most correct. But I love discovering really old ideas, and in this case, it looks like some version of this story is old enough to have informed both Vedic and Germanic tradition. On that note, Simek also notes that some parallels exist between this story and the Greek story of Zeus and Persephone, although he mentions that despite the parallels, the stories probably aren't actually related. But specifically, in that story, Persephone is locked in a cave and Zeus comes to her in the form of a snake, which sounds a little bit like Gunnlóð and Oðinn. There are also some things about this story that remind me personally a little bit of the Greek story of Prometheus, although like Simek, I'm not claiming these stories are actually related. But it's interesting to me how Prometheus is renowned for his knowledge, kind of like Kvasir. In some traditions, he makes humanity out of clay, and this story also contains an account of gods creating a person, albeit here it's out of spit, not clay. And then, of course, Prometheus gives fire to humans and becomes the effective author of human arts and sciences, whereas Oðinn accidentally gives magic mead to humans, providing them talent for poetry and scholarship. But whereas Prometheus is a more benevolent figure, it's important to realize that the reason we have poetry according to the Norse tradition is not because Oðinn gave it to us as a gift, but because he accidentally spat a little bit of mead in the wrong direction while stealing it for himself and the other gods. Like Zeus, his actions often don't measure up to what we would think of as a modern-day good guy. As I mentioned, he even labels himself an evil-doer in this story, and manipulates various characters into doing things that are not in their best interest, to say the least. So it's fascinating that a character like this is regarded as chief of the gods, when the very first being, Ymir, didn't qualify as a god at all on account of the fact that he was, quote, evil. It makes you wonder what Ymir must have done. Unfortunately, wondering is all we can do sometimes. So let's wonder more about Norse traditions together next time on Norse Mythology, the Unofficial Guide. Sources for this episode include Dictionary of Northern Mythology by Rudolf Simek, 2010, Heimskringla, translated by Alison Finlay and Anthony Faulkes, 2011, Norse Mythology, A Guide to the Gods, Heroes, Rituals, and Beliefs by John Lindow, 2001, the Poetic Edda, translated by Carolyne Larrington, 2014, and the Prose Edda, translated by Anthony Faulkes, 1995.